Our short speaker here is Steve Fowkes. Steve Fowkes is an organic chemist, a neurochemist, nutritional formulation consultant, legal expert witness, and is considered an expert in brain function and metabolism. He has written several books, authored numerous articles and papers, illustrated books and scientific papers, and served as editor, technical editor, and guest editors on many more. He is currently writing his 6th book. In 1979, he co-founded a nutrition company, Vitamin Research Products, and managed their research, new product development, manufacturing, data processing, and shipping departments until 1983. In 1982, he founded and continues to direct the Cognitive Enhancement Research Institute. His ability to translate technical topics for the public led to TV appearances on People Are Talking, a San Francisco-based TV talk show, the Dr. Dean Adele Show, a nationally syndicated TV talk show, and CNN's Larry King Live, and several anti-aging documentaries. Steve is available for private and group nutritional counseling. Let's welcome our short speaker, Steve Fowkes.
Thank you. The 6th book is written, and it's about BHT and nutritional therapies for viral disease. So you can get it online for free from projectwellbeing.com. My talk today is about, in a general sense, myths and the way in which we rely upon authority to make decisions, make supposedly intelligent decisions. And we always have to cut corners, because if you had to read all the primary literature about every decision you make, you'd never make any decisions, or they would be few and far between. And one of the things that I've learned in terms of studying scientific experts, and especially medical experts, is that most of them are wrong. And they reach unsupportable conclusions, even with their own research, and that within a period of time of 5 to 15 years, most medical findings are reversed. And that this goes through multiple cycles. So, 200 years ago, bleeding was considered the medical treatment of choice for many diseases, and then it went out of favor, and now I'm an advocate of bleeding. So what's right and what is wrong, and what's out of favor and what's in favor, are often very difficult to discern. And so my message is one of being skeptical, of being open to the possibility that the myths that we live by, the myths that we use to make decisions, aren't necessarily right. And so as examples, I'm going to talk about the idea that meat is dangerous for people to eat. This is a huge popular belief. It's by no means universal, but I believe that of people who study health and who make an effort to modify their diets in positive ways, believe this more than people who are unconscious about their eating. Recently, there have been a series of articles in the last few years about meat, the dangers of eating meat. And recently, there was a series of stories that was spread across the United States that eating eggs was comparably dangerous to smoking cigarettes. And so I figured these would be great examples to talk about how the scientific system works, how researchers conduct research, and why they can fall victim to error of not looking at certain things. And so one of these regarding meat I blogged about on my Google Plus account, and basically asked the question, what is it that's not being asked? When the researchers go out and look at people who are eating meat and people who are avoiding meat, what kinds of questions are they asking? What kinds of questions are they not asking? And how does that bias the research? And so one obvious one is that if you eat meat or not is a yes or no decision, and how you eat meat is not necessarily a yes or no decision at all. Same thing with eggs. And so if you're going to, check the box, do you eat eggs, yes or no? You say, yes, I eat eggs. But there's not a follow-up question that says, well, how do you cook your eggs? And what kind of eggs do you eat? And so one of the things that I've probably talked about quite a bit here is the medical concepts of Dr. Emanuel Ravisi, who I consider to be the brightest medical mind of the last century. And he was born at the turn of the century and died at the end of the century, so on some level he's kind of the epitome of the 20th century medical expert. But one of the things that surprised me was that when he talked about lipids, and he talked about foods that have lipids in them, fats and cholesterol, and specifically about eggs, he said the metabolic character of that food is dramatically different if you cook it or don't cook it. And so when he would say, okay, these foods are alkaline forming, these foods are acid forming, or they're anaerobic and aerobic, or they're anabolic and catabolic, he would put eggs in two different categories depending upon how they were cooked. If they were raw, they were mildly acidifying or neutral, and if they were cooked, even to the edge of being slightly alkalinizing, but if they were cooked, they were definitely acid, massively acid forming. And on looking at it from an inflammatory point of view, eggs go from being pretty much non-inflammatory when they're raw to being highly inflammatory when they're cooked. And so when somebody says eggs are dangerous, I would like to ask the question, are you talking about fried eggs? Are you talking about soft-boiled eggs? Are you talking about raw eggs, hard-boiled eggs? And what's the state of the yolk? And it turns out that that's a critical question. If the yolk is hard, you have the fats in the egg yolk are beginning to go rancid by the cooking process. So you're being exposed to rancid fats, which are mutagens, carcinogens, and teratogens. And they suppress immune system activity. Phagocytes go around eating things, engulfing things. That stops when you have this insult of rancid fat hitting your system. Rancid fat is so dangerous that the taste buds in the throat or in the back of the tongue, when they get stimulated by rancid fat, they make us throw up, so that we get rid of that rancidity before it has a chance to be absorbed and do damage to our system. So there's another aspect to it as well. Ravisi used raw egg yolks as a test for his cancer patients back in 1930, the late 1920s and through the 1930s. He had a cancer treatment clinic in Trafalgar Hospital in New York. This was before he was ostracized by the cancer industry. And he would diagnose the character, the metabolic characters of people's cancer by feeding them a cup of coffee and a raw egg yolk. And so the cup of coffee is a herbal-based alkalinizing agent that would last about 8 to 10 hours. And the egg yolk is a lipid-based alkalinizing agent, which would have a comparable time frame. And he would give this to his newly diagnosed cancer patients who are coming into his clinic, and if their pain got worse, they would have one kind of cancer, and if their pain eased, they would have a different kind of cancer. And when he treated them, he found that that diagnosis was right 90% of the time. So that whole issue of raw egg yolks and it being used as an anabolic challenge, an alkaline challenge, and cooked egg yolks being a strong, powerful acidifying challenge, gave me this insight into food. And when somebody posts this finding on the massive headlines that eating eggs is as dangerous as smoking cigarettes, I asked the question, are they talking about cooked eggs? And it makes perfect sense to me that they would. When you're talking about an inflammatory insult to the human body, in a society that has endemic inflammation, I can see how this would be a serious problem, and that this is not a smart thing to do, and it's something that I don't do. I don't eat hard-boiled eggs anymore, except maybe once a week, once a year, if I have a craving for deviled eggs. And but rancid fat from the egg yolk, from the cooked egg yolk, and oxidized cholesterol from the cooked egg yolk pose serious risks to your cardiovascular system. And so the researchers who are studying eggs don't know to ask this question. What kind of eggs do you eat? How do you cook your eggs? Do you eat hard-boiled eggs or not? What percentage of your eggs that you eat are hard-boiled or not? And so what they do is they blend together the people who are eating eggs responsibly and the people who are eating eggs irresponsibly. Regarding meat, you know, they blend together the people who are eating grass-fed beef and the people who are eating moldy grain-fed beef. So the question comes down to the finding, what's the percentage of people who are eating the good versus the bad form? And on the whole, because most Americans are unconscious eaters, they overwhelm the people who are being responsible. So that was the point that I raised on my blog on Google Plus about eating meat, was how do you distinguish between people who are conscious meat eaters who choose to eat meat and are very picky about the kind of meat that they eat, and to separate those from the people who are unconscious meat eaters? And how do you separate people who overeat meat from people who don't overeat meat? And the point that I would caution you is that the researchers don't really ask those kinds of questions. They have to boil it down to a very, very simple, questionnaire-based system, and they also have many times an agenda to only ask the questions that they're interested in, and so the part that they're not interested in, the bias in the system, doesn't actually get fleshed out. They don't collect that kind of data, and so it gets lost. And so there's a minority of people in the United States who are eating eggs consciously, and a minority of people in the United States who are eating meat consciously, and those people should have their health evaluated independently of the people who are eating unconsciously. And so that's one of the empowering aspects of choice, is that when you make a choice and you invest in it, it becomes a placebo response in your health. And if you're unconscious, you're eating, barbecued ribs at a bluegrass festival, and because that's all you've known all your life, you're not making a deliberate choice about it. And so not only you may be eating meat that has been fed, rancid grain, and the animal is diabetic when it's killed, but there. Candies. Well, that's the same kind of thing. Grain is a very rich source of carbohydrate, and you can feed the animals expired candy. Any source of sugar will induce diabetes in the animal, and diabetes produces marble fat in the muscle of the animal, which makes it nice and tender, breaks down the connective tissue that makes it easy to chew and easy to digest and easy to cut with a fork. And this is all considered, grade A beef? And so, basically, the game is rigged. So, that was my message. I think I've got maybe 5 more minutes, so I'd like to open it up for questions and let you guys direct it from now on.
What about the
Salmonella
salmonella
is a contaminant of meat or eggs.
on raw eggs?
Yes. Yeah. So if the egg is not protected properly, it can be contaminated with microbes. Also, uncooked egg white absorbs a little bit of the avidin protein, absorbs a little bit of biotin. But if you're eating the yolk, if you separate the yolk out, that's a minimal risk. Or if you soft boil it so that you cook the outside of the white, it's very unlikely to be contaminated. But What's worse, having a bout of salmonella and fighting it off, or taking antibiotics and the consequences of wiping out your gut flora for the rest of your life? Yeah. But salmonella can be a contaminant. E. coli can be a contaminant in all kinds of foods. Yeah. And that's typically more of a risk for animal-based foods than vegetable-based foods. Yes?
So the grass-fed beef has significant amounts of omega-3. When you cook it,
More, yes.
do you get significant problems with it oxidizing, going rancid?
No. The question is the omega-3 in the beef, when you cook it, does it go rancid? And the answer is basically no. Same thing with fish, the omega-3 in fish. But omega-3 oxidizes readily and omega-6 oxidizes readily. It has more to do with how many double bonds it has than whether it's the 3 or the 6. And so whether it's omega-6 going rancid or omega-3 going rancid, it poses the same risk. But when you cook meat, the temperature that produces rancidity tends to be well above the temperature of boiling water. And when you're cooking meat, the interior part of the meat doesn't get above the boiling point of water. So it's self-limiting. Now, on the outside of the meat, you do get rancidity, and you do get polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the browning effect like you get on a loaf of bread. The outside layer is carcinogenic, the inside is not. So it matters on the outside surface of it. But if you're eating, let's say, salmon, which has a very sensitive oil in it, the flesh itself protects the oil against rancidity when you're cooking it. Yes? Revici, R-E-V-I-C-I. And he was blacklisted by the American cancer industry and fought, I think it was like close to 10 battles with the New York medical authorities to have his license revoked. And finally, when he was 93, they got his license. But he was brilliant. He was a core researcher. He studied acid and alkaline effects at a core level, and came to classify foods based on what he called anabolic-catabolic balance, which is also acid and alkaline balance and aerobic-anaerobic balance. And so I blend them all together because the terms that he used weren't really consistent with modern English. And so every one of those terms is misleading in some way. And so when you blend them all together, they're misleading in mutually incompatible ways, so everybody stays confused enough that it's not misleading. Yes. As a matter of fact, his one of the last interviews he ever gave was a taped message for some AIDS council back in Washington, D.C., and I have the only surviving copy of that tape in existence in the world. Yeah. So what he ended up doing was classifying foods based on things like wound pH. So he would administer foods to animals, shift their diets, and study what would be happening to their pH effects at the level of urine, at the level of blood, at the level of the cellular interstitial fluids. And he would classify foods based on that kind of standard. And at the time when I first ran across Revici, I looked at his list and I said, this looks familiar. And then I realized this looks like George Ahira's book on macrobiotics, which was acid and alkaline, where he classified food based on the traditional Chinese medicine practices related to macrobiotics. And when I matched the two lists up, there was an 85% agreement. So you had the Eastern empiricism approach and the Western experimental approach, which had an 85% agreement. So that was one of the things that started me on this path, that motivated me to start digging into some of this old literature and finding all kinds of neat gems that are basically outside of the entire educational process in Orthodox medicine. Yeah. Yes? Oh, yeah. Well, no, there's very little research. The question is, people who consciously eat meat and consciously eat eggs, is there any research on them? And the answer is no. There is clinical research taking place where doctors are studying these people, and people are studying each other who are looking at the health, what the effects this has on their health complaints.
I didn't get the question, the answer. I didn't get. Research or there's no research?
Well, if you define research as people paying attention, there is research. If you're talking about papers published in journals that are peer-reviewed, which is, you know, by some orthodox, you know, under some orthodox institution, then no, there isn't.
To see what people eating and what kind of disease they have. If they have cancer or they have stroke.
It's not easy.
Why not?
Because because they do it badly consistently. So it's not easy. If it was easy, they would do it right. First of all, one of their major approaches is questionnaire-based. And so they're relying upon people's memories to answer the questions. This is really a disaster.
I thought that all this industry actually counting the numbers, how many people actually, you know, all this medicine industry here actually knows how many people actually have disease. So we know the numbers. So if these people actually have disease or not have disease, if they can actually ask what kind of meat they used to eat, if it was conscious or non-conscious.
They could ask that question, but they don't.
But if I can know, at least, you know, I can.
Yeah. And so grass-fed beef is not studied independently of grain-fed beef. And the vast majority of beef in the United States is grain-fed. And as the industry has shifted to higher and higher levels of mold exposure in the grain and higher degrees of force feeding, and the later addition of expired candy, for example, to the animals to just give them sugar, just like, you know, like kids would eat, that is affecting the entire population, except the people who are conscious meat eaters who deliberately will not buy or eat that kind of meat.
The reason I'm asking is because on West Europe and North America, there's the highest number of you know, cancer and osteoporosis, and the highest number of meat eaters and
Right.
milk. So that's
Yes.
why I'm asking.
Well, I agree that that's an issue. I think that milk, it's very clear from the primary literature that drinking milk does not protect you against osteoporosis. In matter of fact, it makes your risk of osteoporosis worse. And that overeating meat, overeating any kind of grain protein source can increase your risk of osteoporosis. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for example, I was just at the Quantified Self Conference this weekend, and I was talking to Josh Witten, and he was talking about 50 grams of protein. So here's somebody following a Paleolithic diet where he's eating very small amounts of meat. Yeah. Yeah. And so, you know, what I do is I pay attention to the anecdotal reports. You know, the scientific literature says that's all based on myth, and that they think asking people questions based on their memory and doing questionnaires somehow makes it statistical because they have huge numbers and they can do statistical analysis of it. So they think that makes it scientific, when the memories of people in terms of what they ate and how they misreport things is it's truly awesome. Versus, you know, the anecdotal stuff where you're studying people one by one, and you can see these kinds of reports. People who have issues with weight or arthritis or whatever, and it clears up. You know, I note those kinds of things, even though the mainstream authorities would say that that's not valid information. But that's what Eastern medicine is really based on, that kind of slow, patient, observational-based conclusion. Yeah. Yes?
I want to make a comment on, there's also a correlation between grain-fed chickens and chickens that eat greens. I mean, the healthy yolk is actually orange, not yellow.
Mm-hmm.
And there's such massive fraud. You go to the grocery store and it says cage-free eggs, and they're not cage-free. And the only reason I know that is because I grew up in a commercial chicken farm, and so you get the yolk is actually supposed to be orange, and if it's yellow, then
Yeah. A healthy chicken eats bugs and greens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the cholesterol content on a grain-fed chicken is actually quite a lot higher than the cholesterol in the yolk in the chicken that's outside eating greens and bugs and snakes.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and fat in animals that are out in the wild and grass-fed is typically not white. It can be strongly colored yellow and even bordering on orange because of the carotene content of the fat. Yeah. Way back.
So you said
Oh.
that overeating meat, and then you mentioned the gentleman that had 50 grams, did you say, of protein or of meat a day? And my question is, what is your how much do you think is overeating?
Well, somebody who's sedentary, I think that's fine. And I don't really remember exactly whether he was talking about 50 grams of protein or 50 grams of meat. I believe it was 50 grams of meat, but it could be wrong. That it may also be that he wasn't paying that close attention to what he said, but I can always follow up with him and find out the answer to that question. But the issue of how much protein do you need depends on your physical activity and what kind of damage you're doing to your body and what kinds of healing responses do you need to accommodate, and to some extent what kind of protein you're eating. So if you're, for example, supplementing your diet with collagen protein, that's very poor quality protein from the perspective of building muscle. Extremely poor. But it's good for building connective tissue, ligaments, tendons, skin, that kind of stuff. So, and there's inefficiencies. Meat tends to be very good protein, milk, and eggs from the perspective of amino acid profile. So typically if you're eating protein from other kinds of foods, vegetable foods and grain foods, you have to eat a little bit more to balance out the amino acids. But the point is that I think that there's a lot of people who have an expectation that the Paleolithic diet is, carnivory, where you're eating massive quantities of meat. And for a lot of the Paleolithic proponents, they're eating very little meat. So I imagine that there might be somebody in the world who would be eating 50% meat and 50% vegetable foods as a diet, as an extreme. And then the other extreme would be basically, 1% meat would be enough to balance out the meat nutritional requirements of somebody. So that's what I would say the human animal is that broadly based in terms of optimum health to have that big a variation from person to person to person to person. Okay, so we are now going to break. Take a couple more? Okay. Yes.
So when you talk about eating raw eggs versus cooked eggs, how realistic is it that the people in this audience will start eating raw eggs, or that they would start separating the yolk from the white, or that they would fuss? I mean, is being conscious mean being fussy?
I don't eat raw eggs myself. I eat soft-boiled eggs, and I soft-boil them less than the normal amount of time so that some of the white is liquid when I'm eating it, but the yolk is not in any way hard. That's how I judge it, and that's the easiest thing for me because, again, it's very convenient. You just put the egg in the boiling water and count off the minutes, and then you know when it's ready to go. It's like 2 or 2.5 minutes, something like that.
But, from a Paleolithic and from anthropological perspective, if people are not going to eat the raw egg that they would have found in nature, in nature they wouldn't be cooking their eggs.
They might if they collected a whole bunch of them, but if they're out in the wild and they're hungry and they find an egg, they'd eat it right on the spot. Yeah.
So what about? I mean, obviously, and I studied a lot of anthropology, and I went to Africa, and I saw how easy it is, and in nature it would be very difficult for a person who just lives totally in the wild to find sufficient eggs to actually even talk about it as a part of the diet. It would be very rare.
That's right.
If at all. So
Animals have a big incentive to hide their eggs very effectively. Yes.
So why would we get so much into talking about eating something that obviously in nature we would almost in grains and in other foods. So, and it's been proven several times that when you increase your methionine level, you increase your risk of colorectal cancer, you increase the risk of short life. I mean, lifespan is significantly reduced in animal studies, has been done, based on methionine level.
Yeah.
So how is cooking versus raw?
That doesn't change that.
Methionine?
It
It doesn't?
doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't at all. And it's not just methionine. It's also tryptophan and cysteine and maybe, histidine or something like that. Yeah, that has a negative impact on aging. Did you have your hand up? Okay.
Yes, Steve,
Okay.
you didn't say anything about length of cooking or rare, medium, well done. Does any of that make any difference in the chemistry?
Oh, yeah. When you go above the boiling point of water, you create a whole new kind of chemistry. It involves dehydration chemistry, where you get things called AGEs, advanced glycation end products. The browning of the outside of a loaf of bread is a browning reaction. And you get the same thing when you cook meat on an open flame or you fry it. You get the same kind of elevated temperatures. When you've got, if you stir fry, for example, you're kind of it's a hybrid. You have a little bit of frying kinds of temperatures in the bottom, but as the food is coming in contact with the hot oil, it's giving off water vapor, and that's doing most of the cooking of the food that's sitting above it. So stir frying is kind of a hybrid kind of a thing. But when you steam food, it gets up to a couple hundred degrees Fahrenheit, and and then that denatures all the protein, and that's then now cooked. And that, as opposed to frying or baking, where you put something in an oven at 350 degrees, that's hot enough to do an entirely different kind of chemistry on the outside of the food. Okay? That answer your question?
So are you saying steaming is not good?
No, steaming is what I prefer, and slow cooking things at very low temperatures. But if it depends on what you're going for. So, for example, let me caution you that there are some foods that shouldn't be cooked, like, for example, breast milk. You know, when you're feeding a baby, you never want to cook milk. You don't want to microwave it. You don't. If you're going to warm it up, you put it in a double boiler so that the heat doesn't get high enough to denature the proteins and the immune system factors in the food. So if you want a food that's got a high energy content or enzyme content, let's say like pineapple, when you cook it, it's gone. So in that situation, you definitely want to eat it raw. Okay? Okay?
Organic meat, is that necessarily grass-fed meat?
No. Mold is 100% organic. Yes. Yeah, the gentle cooking damages the food the least. And so a lot of it comes down to the energy content you get from your food. And so if you're eating a lot of food, you don't need to cook it in order to, because if you're getting extra calories, you've still got enough calories to digest the food, and that you may want to reduce your calorie need. So raw food puts more of a calorie burden on the digestion of your food. It takes more energy to digest it, and so you're getting less net calories, and most Americans eat too much, overeat regularly. And so when they go on a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet, they're doing calorie restriction. And most people who overeat benefit greatly by any kind of caloric restriction, whether it's eating meat and eating fat or eating vegetables exclusively. There's a caloric restriction process. And so losing weight and burning fat turns out to have all kinds of wonderful health benefits. And even in hospice programs, when you get people with advanced cancer and they go into the final state and they decide, okay, I'm about to die, and so they stop eating. And a significant minority of those people recover. Okay?
Thank you. We're going to have a 10-minute break. Before we do, Kathleen has an announcement about I think, what subject is that? And then we'll start again.
Hi, I just want to speak briefly about a unique opportunity we have this November to get GMOs labeled in the state of California. I did bring a few materials, not very many, but I'm a volunteer with California Right to Know. You know, big pharma, big chema, big agra, big food, they're spending about 25 to 30 million right now to dissuade voters to vote in their own interest to get things labeled. We're a grassroots movement. We have maybe 3 million or less. So what we can do now is talk to our family, our neighbors. If you're willing to volunteer and hand out a few cards or whatever you feel inspired to do, we must, in fact, person to person, communicate with each other in order to get this passed. All of the money spent by the bigs, and Monsanto included, has managed to undo this in numerous other states. So please take this as a grassroots movement, and you know, it's just about labeling. We're not even getting into the conversation about whether it's good or bad for you. We're going to start with square one. So who doesn't want the right to know what's in their food? That's the basic message. Thank you.